Your poetry final is comprised of two parts. You've got the context and you have your literary analysis. Both are driven by your thesis. Your thesis draws conclusions about your poet. What are the common themes that your poet writes about? What stands out about your poet? Your thesis drives everything. As you're planning the context that you include in your paper, think about your thesis. Please don't write the entire biography of your poet. That's dull, that's boring. Consider your audience. Your audience does not need the whole biography of your poet. And that's kind of like a fourth grade assignment, is to, rehash where your poet was born, where lived, where went to school, who married, how many children had. Not interested in that kind of stuff, unless it relates to your thesis. So, as you're planning your context, think carefully about which context should I include? Which context matters? When we talked about Emily Dickinson in class, remember when we could be together last Thursday and we talked about Emily Dickinson in class, we did talk about her context. She lived by herself up in her attic. She was embarrassed that she wasn't married. She did not have much about her life that she was happy about. And so it was fitting that she wrote about anger and death as she secluded herself upstairs in her attic. So the context I shared with you at the beginning of that activity was not where she went to school, how many children she had. Well, she didn't have any children. I suppose that would fit though, wouldn't it? Because that was another reason she was upset, because she was lonely. Anyway, I chose my context carefully. The context that my readers would need to understand the points I'm making about the poetry she's writing. Let me show you a few examples. Start with some Edgar Allan Poe, one of my favorites. The thesis of this paper, this was written by a student last year. The thesis of this paper is tragic events and losses that plagued Edgar Allan Poe's life inspired the creepy, dark imagery, tone, meter, and rhyme throughout his collections of poems. So now the reader is going to expect the context to relate to tragic events and losses. And indeed it does. It begins by going into the death of Poe's parents. Poe's mother died from tuberculosis. Father abandoned him and his siblings. Poe was an orphan. He was adopted by the wealthy John Francis Allen. They provided a home. However, they eventually ditched him too. They were good to him at first, and things looked all right for Poe, but eventually they ditched him too. So the context of this paper relates to all of the losses that Poe endured, which relates to your thesis up here. Many of you are writing about Langston Hughes. I don't recommend writing your context if you are studying Langston Hughes about his parents, because his parents didn't influence his poetry. I mean, he had parents, yeah, but that's not a good enough reason to write about his parents in your context. What influenced Langston Hughes' poetry is the time period in which he lived and the segregation and discrimination going on in that time period. So your context, if you're writing about Langston Hughes, is not going to be about his parents and that they divorced and his dad moved to Mexico and his mom was in Kansas and Poe lived with his grandma for a while. While those things are true, they're probably not going to relate to the conclusions you draw about his poetry, that it was the time period he lived in that inspired how he wrote and what he wrote. So your context is not going to be about his family. It's going to be about the world he lived in. Another example I want to show you. What if you're writing about a poet and really context doesn't matter very much? The life of the poet really didn't figure in very much. This paper is about William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth just really, his life didn't influence his poetry. What he saw happening around him, though, did. His thesis is William Wordsworth uses his methods of rhyming, word choice, and imagery to depict beauty and flaws of nature, which implies the happiness and cruelty that is felt towards others. This writer noticed that William Wordsworth's poetry has a lot to do with how one human treats another human. Kind of like Shirley Jackson, The Lottery. What are we doing to each other? Where are our priorities? What are we noticing? And so the context of this paper doesn't focus on who Wordsworth married, how many children he had, where he went to school. Let me read you this context. William Wordsworth lived from 1770 to 1850. The citation is done well in this one too, you guys. According to the Poetry Foundation, a scholarly site on poets and their poems, William Wordsworth was one of the founders of English Romanticism and one of its most central figures and important intellects. He started writing poetry early in grammar school. His surroundings all throughout his life, here's where we're getting to the point, his surroundings all throughout his life influenced his works. As he grew older, he became very concerned about the human relationship and how it dealt with nature. Wordsworth had an immense passion for nature, as you could conclude by how many of his works are detailed with those images. As he got older, he was involved with politics and had very strong political opinions on tyranny and the way that mankind treated each other. He had great sympathy for the common man. After a while, his passion for poetry took over his passion and opinions on politics. And the context continues. But you can see how this context relates directly to the thesis that Wordsworth is going to focus on how humans treat each other and how nature plays into this. Once you've got your context figured out, now you go into your literary analysis, and that's the second main part of your paper. First main part is context, and it doesn't have to be really long. Look at this paper has one paragraph of context, and then it goes into literary analysis. The literary analysis should be the heart of your paper. It is the biggest part of your paper. So allow it to be. Please don't write me only one paragraph analyzing your poems. That's not enough. That's not going to do the job. You need to really analyze the poetry. Well, let's keep looking at this one. Let me see which paragraph did I want to show you. Yeah, this is a good, let's go right to the next one. Look at how this paragraph analyzes the poetry, how it relates back up to that thesis. Wordsworth has the ability to compare nature with the human condition, and he does exactly that in The World is Too Much With Us, one of my favorite poems, by the way. Wordsworth writes in the first stanza how we have given ourselves away and we don't realize the power in being able to really see nature. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our power. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. His idea is that we are wasting our time. We're spending too much time worrying about the materialistic ideas in life. There's no concern for nature and the beauty that it holds. We're giving away our hearts, bodies, minds, and souls to the materialistic world and not to the world that was created for us. The speaker states, for this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. As humans, everyone is unsure about things around us, and we tend to focus on ourselves. Everyone is out of tune with the world around them. The speaker then reflects, saying, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. This particular idea is that of standing in a beautiful meadow will make the speaker less forlorn and sad. Nature is so beautiful that it will take all of his worries away if he would just look at it. This is Wordsworth's point in The World is Too Much With Us. We are too materialistic and need to look at the world around us. Wordsworth uses his word choice and the ability to compare the human condition to nature to depict flaws, which implies the cruelty and materialistic ideas of mankind. This paragraph does a really good job of, it starts with a longer block quote, but then it explains, it interprets those lines for us, explaining to us readers how these lines relate to that thesis about we humans and that our priorities are a bit confused. And then this writer goes on and includes additional direct quote with interpretation after the direct quote, simply explaining what the lines mean. Here's a line, here's what it means. Here's a line, here's what it means. And then in the end, coming back to that warrant, dealing with language from your thesis, mankind, and the flaws of mankind. In this case, the materialistic flaws. Let me see. Do you want to see another one? If you don't want to see another one, fast forward a minute. But here's another one by Poe. Let's look at a body paragraph of Poe. Now, Poe's body paragraphs, they really relate strongly to context. And so you're going to see context showing up in this body paragraph, which is different from the previous one. Not much context showed up. Here's some context in this body paragraph. I remember Poe is the poet. Everyone died. He lost everybody. Sad. He writes doom and gloom. As Poe's life progressed and loved ones' lives were lost, Poe chooses imagery depicting death, horror, and grief. So we're gonna hear about the death, horror, and grief, those images that he writes about in his poem. His pictures are soon painted black throughout his poems. Isn't that a good sentence? After the death of his mother, father, and mother-like figures, Frances Allan, Poe could only see the darkness life had to offer. Not long after, his wife was struck by tuberculosis and was also on the road to death. According to Sterne, they were dreadful years during which she was never really well. Blood vessels in the lungs broke again. A year later, Poe wrote again, and even once again at varying intervals. He was devastated when he heard the news, and his writing reflected it. Poe's most famous poem, The Raven, repeats the image of a black raven, forcing his readers to feel woe with the speaker. He writes, "Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore." The ancient royal black raven symbolizes death both literally and figuratively. Poe references his wife's death by characterizing a diseased Lenore and her mourning lover. The raven and its soul word nevermore represents the death of not only Lenore, but the internal death of her lover's soul. Poe feels empty inside after the tragic news of his wife's sickness, prompting the writing of this poem. Evil follows him like a shadow, and Poe is aware of this, as he says, "And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore." The demon raven, or evil, would not leave Poe's life. It would continue to kill those he loves. Thus, the only escape would be his own death. Grim stuff, huh? That's Poe. But this paragraph does a really good job of stating this topic sentence up at the top. Poe keeps losing people, and he's depicting that loss, that grief, that death in his poetry. And then the writer analyzes a poem that does that. Hey, here, let me show you the raven. There's death in the raven. And that raven symbolizes the blackbird in itself. And the words in here, too, symbolize and draw attention to that theme of death. So, two main things you need to do in your literary analysis. You start with context, but you have to think purposefully about the context. Which context matters? Include that context in your paper. The context that doesn't matter, that doesn't relate to the theme and your thesis, don't include it. Your reader knows that stuff anyway. So don't include it just to fill space or because you feel like you have to give a bio of your poet. Not the purpose here. The purpose is to include the context that relates to your thesis. If you're struggling to figure out what that is, let's arrange a conversation, either a Snapchat video conference or we can conference over a program I've learned how to use called Zoom. Second main idea, second thing that matters. Literary analysis is the heart. It is the meat and potatoes of this paper. Do not write only one paragraph of literary analysis. You're not going to be happy with the grade that you get on that. Because this is a literary analysis assignment, you need to have multiple paragraphs that present a topic sentence. Hey, here's a main theme. Here's something the poet is doing. And then you're going to reference the poetry that does that, just like we saw in our samples today. Leave comments down below if you have questions, or just let me know that you're out there. And good luck. Happy writing.